everyone. Good evening. Can you hear me? Great. Welcome to the Robert Mondavi Institute for Wine and Food Science and the Spring 2016 Walt Klenz Lectureship on Wine Business. My name is Claire Hassler-Lewis. I'm the founding executive director of the Institute, and it's great to see so many familiar faces here tonight, some new faces, and a lot of students. So thank you for coming tonight. We've had the pleasure of hosting this lectureship series once or twice a year since 2011. And this year we're only hosting one, and this is it. So we're going to have a special treat tonight. The goal of the lectureship is to bring esteemed winemakers and wine business professionals to campus to speak about many issues related to the wine industry. And I think we've met that goal tonight with Michael Mondavi and his son Rob. They just spent an hour and 15 minutes speaking to the viticulture and enology students. And I just heard Michael say he wanted to go back and register as a student. So we're so thrilled to have you both here tonight. And Michael is also recently a member of the honorary board of the Robert Mondavi Institute. So we thank you for your service in that regard. I'm going to turn the microphone over to the man whose lecture this is named for, who is Walt Klenz. This lectureship was established in honor of his retirement in 2005 by Behringer Glass, now Treasury Wine Estates. And so I will turn the podium over to Walt. This is being videotaped and audio taped, just so you know. Don't say anything untoward.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you so much for your continued support of this lecture series. It's been a great honor for me to be able to come up here once or twice a year and have such a great list of speakers talk to groups such as this. And although this may be our largest turnout ever, Michael and Rob. Indeed, our speakers today are Michael and Rob Mondavi, very appropriate in the building that we're sitting in, that they're here to speak to today about a subject that I think they're uniquely qualified to talk about, generational changes in the wine industry, which is, I think, going to be very, very interesting. Just a quick bio. Michael co-founded the Robert Mondavi Winery with his father back in 1966. I just saw a picture of the 50th anniversary bottle, Cabernet. It looks really nice. And spent over 30 years at the Robert Mondavi Winery, holding every important position in the company, including CEO and chairman at one time or another. Rob joined Robert Mondavi some years later, primarily in the sales and marketing area, and had a number of key executive positions in that area as well. But I think importantly, I think in 1999, Michael and his family decided to form a new company, a new venture, Michael Mondavi Family Estate, which would be focused on producing luxury Napa Valley wines that the whole family could be involved in. And that again started in 1999. Rob, I think, joined that in 2004 as president of the president of winemaking, which that position he still holds today. In 2004, Michael and his family created a new company, Folio Fine Wine Partners, very different business than Michael Mondavi Family Estates. Essentially a sales and marketing company providing sales marketing services to their own wines, their own Napa Valley wines, which were coming out at that time. Plus, very importantly, a large range, more than a dozen family-owned fine wineries in Europe, providing importing and distribution and sales and marketing services to those companies here in the United States. So between their own operations here in California and their many relationships with some of the most important wine families in Europe, I don't think, as I say, anyone is more qualified to talk about today's subject than Michael and Rob Mondavi. So it's my pleasure to introduce. I don't know who's coming up first. Well, Michael and Rob Mondavi.
We're going to do a duet.
Thank you. Well, great. Very much.
First of all, it's an honor to be here, and thank you all for taking your time to share it with us this evening. I thought we'd take about 2 hours to talk about the history of wine. But realistically, what I learned, particularly in the last 15 years, is how young we are in the California wine business and in Napa compared to other parts of the world. We have the luxury of working with the Frescobaldi family, who've only been doing this since the 12th century. They traded wine for art with Michelangelo. The Antinori family, 600 plus years. In Chile, they've been growing grapes and making wine longer than we have in Napa Valley. And so the more we would travel around the world, we realized that we were really a relatively infant business. The first winery in Napa Valley was the Charles Krug Winery, fortunately now owned by my cousins, the Mark and Pete Jr. Mondavis. And at that time, from 1853 till 1900, there went from one winery to over 300 wineries in Napa Valley. The majority of the vineyards in Napa at that time were hillsides. The valley floor was the market basket, the fruits, the vegetables, etc., the row crops, to feed the San Francisco area. When phylloxera hit in the early 1900s, started wiping out the vineyards, followed by prohibition from 1919 to 1933, it essentially went from 300 wineries down to about a dozen. And it was a very difficult time for the Napa Valley and the wine business. The government has had more impact on the wine business over the last 100 years than agriculture. And it's really interesting. You think about it, prohibition, you come out of prohibition, the wine business starts going, and it's the modern age for California. They don't ship wine in bottles as we know it. They ship wine in tank cars, rail cars to the east, to the Midwest, to regional wholesalers and distributors. They would get the wine, put it in tanks, blend it, bottle it under their regional names. So there were very few national brands. Gallo, Italian Swiss Colony, Roma, a few, not many. World War II, 1941, the wage and price control comes in, freezes the price of bulk wine at 12.5 cents a gallon. And it's yummy. People in the San Joaquin Valley, my grandfather who was making wine there, could make money because it cost him about 8 or 9 cents. My father making wine in Napa from 37 through the 40s cost him about 10 to 12 cents, so he could barely get by. But they found, my father discovered, along with a lot of other winemakers in California, convert the commodity to a consumer product. You can charge any price the market would bear. And my father, in his infinite wisdom, said, I think I can sell Napa Valley Cabernet for 25 cents a bottle. And convinced his father and his brother to buy the Charles Krug Winery in January of '43 that was then defunct. It came with a brand, nice vineyard, couple of homes, 160 acres for $75,000. And by converting wine, the commodity, to the consumer product, Charles Krug Winery and many other wineries in California thrived. Again, creativity caused by government controls or laws. There was kind of the rebirth from those late 40s after the war. The 50s and 60s were very difficult. A few distilleries came in and started buying wineries. Roma, Cresta Blanca, others were purchased by large distilleries, and they thought they were going to control the whole distribution of wines in America. It was interesting. It took most of them about 8 to 12 years to discover that they could make a small fortune in the wine business by starting with a big one. And they sold those wineries and those brands for a lower price. So that was really kind of the first wave of consolidation in the California wine business. Then in the 50s, 60s, we were all natural farming. We didn't know it, we didn't call it organic farming, but that's all we really knew then. But with the advent of more fertilizer, herbicides, pesticides, fungicides, the wine industry, whether it was Napa, San Joaquin Valley, almost went to chemical dependence from natural farming. In the 60s, 70s, early 80s, we finally started waking up and realizing we have to respect the soil and we have to get back to natural farming, organic farming. And it made a big, big difference. The vineyards were mainly planted in the 40s and 50s, not for the ideal spacing for the vineyard, for the Ford and Caterpillar tractors. 8 by 12, 10 by 10, so the tractors could fit through. What's happened in the last 15, 20 years? The spacing is going according to the soil, the grape variety, and what is best for producing quality fruit. It's been a big, big change in the thinking. The marketing aspect. The tasting in Paris, 1976, where Stag's Leap and Chateau Montelena came first in a blind tasting. It woke the world up that America, California, particularly Napa Valley, could produce world-class wines. 2 years later, 1978, the Maury Schaefer, I think it was, on 2020, came out and reported to the world that wine was healthy and good for you in moderation. And Walt, you probably remember, we couldn't keep red wine on shelves for 2 or 3 years. I mean, people who wouldn't think about buying wine were doing it. Let me back up a little bit. I forgot one interesting statistic. In 1966, when my father and I started Robert Mondavi Winery, we had 3 employees, my father, myself, one other. 82% of all wine consumed in America in 1965-66 was port, sherry, or muscatel. 18% was what you would call table wine. And of that 18%, Gallo, Italian Swiss Colony, Roma, Cresta Blanca, etc., was about 95% of that. What we consider fine wines today, and I'll be very generous and say anything $10 and above, was under 2% of all wines sold in America today, back then, 1966. And when I told my friends in college before we started in 66 that I was in the wine business, my family was, and I was going to go in the wine business, they thought I was talking about making MD 2020 for Skid Row. They had no idea. When people talked about Napa, they knew more about Napa because of the mental hospital than they did about grapes or wine. It's true. So there were really generations, and we've seen us go from natural farming to chemical dependency, now to natural farming. I don't think that's going to revert back. I think we're there to stay and to respect the soil and what it takes. But the type of business has changed. We were in the California wine business in the 50s and 60s. Then in the 60s and 70s, we were in the kind of the American wine business and really had to do a job throughout the United States. And all of a sudden, oh my goodness, we're in the global wine business. And whether it was having wine bottled under a national label, if you will, in other countries, or bringing wine in containers and bottling foreign wines here, all of a sudden, our Cabernets, our Chardonnays, etc., were competing not just with other wines from California. We were competing with other wines from around the world, whether you were an expensive wine or a more reasonably priced wine. So we got more mature as more people wanted to learn about those wines. We went from really selling in the three-tier system. Think about it. In 1941, everything sold in tank trucks. After that, slowly converting from bottler wholesalers to wholesalers who only handle case goods, to the wineries up until really, and Rob's going to take over, a few years ago, the wineries would sell to the wholesaler would sell to the retailer or restaurateur, the retailer or restaurateur would sell to the consumer. Today, for the fine wines, you can't just be in that old model. And this has changed only in the last 12 to 15 years, and it's almost changed overnight.
This is really lackluster for me. He gets all the history, he gets, all this. And
You got the future.
And then I get the generational change that I've seen is quite interesting. And it really is pretty remarkable that one little company changed the world of how we look at bringing luxury tier wines to market. It was really because FedEx developed package tracking that we were then, as a wine industry, able to ship across state lines. Of course, there had to be some reciprocity and the ability to ship across state lines, which very quickly started to develop. But it changed the business model. The business model that Dad grew up in and Dad developed, it was a requirement, no matter really where you were, to go through the three-tier system. In California, you could go direct to trade, but you needed a distribution house to do it. You needed the trucks and the transport logistics, and most importantly, you needed the collections. Walt, that was the hardest barrier that we found when we were at Robert Mondavi and opening a distribution house in California. It wasn't the logistics of the delivery, it wasn't the order taking, it was the damn collections. So,
Are you going to get paid?
Are you going to get paid? But digressing back to the I think it was 94, wasn't it? When FedEx started that tracking? Because it was about 4 years after the WDO, Wine Definition Ordinance in Napa Valley. And that's changed everything for Napa. And it's changed it by allowing high-tier wines to make it into collectors' hands and have those high-tier wines be able to be sustainable in Napa Valley. Let me talk about why that's important. My dad mentioned that in '43, Krug was purchased, 160 acres at $75,000. Now, if you came in and offered somebody $75,000 for an acre of land in Napa Valley, they'd tell you to go stuff it. You can't buy land for that. You're looking at $150,000 an acre up to $400,000, $500,000 for some trophy acquisitions. So now, in order to be able to have a newcomer come into Napa Valley to acquire land and to develop a luxury tier brand, that brand really won't have a chance to succeed if it's sold through the three-tier system because there isn't enough margin and enough profitability there. So when you cut out the three-tier system and you go direct to a collector, then you basically have a 4x profit on top of what you would have gone through the three-tier system. So this has changed how we need to communicate with collectors, with consumers. It's how really Bill Harlan, with his Harlan Wines and others of Screaming Eagle, have managed to circumvent the three-tier system. It's because of what happened in 1994. So just almost the inverse of when there was constriction around the ability to sell wine beyond 12 cents a gallon and how we had to get creative there. Because we were actually able to then have regulation loosened up, the industry changed again. I'm really fascinated to see how the industry will continue to evolve further. We've had a great conversation earlier with the students here and discussed critics, blogs, social media, how wine is discussed and communicated through millennials and also through my generation X and then through what you're seeing now.
My generation old.
But it's nice, though, to see that we are all demanding information in different fashions now beyond the classic critics. And one of the questions that I posed back to the group that we are talking with today is, so then what happens? Who are the next level of critics? We can't just go into a storm of bloggers and a sea of social media discussions on wines. There will be, I think, people who will take center stage with respect to critiquing wine. And one of the conversations that was heartfelt to me today was that people would like to see an evolution of the scoring system. So it's more about the style, more of a panel discussion of what these wines are like. And I thought that was quite interesting. So the evolution that I think that we'll continue to see in press and media is maybe it will become more personal. But I do think that that will have to evolve, really because how millennials demand to see information come to them and how they're looking for different authenticity of information is different than I had access to. I'm 44, so when I was going through grade school, I still had the Dewey Decimal System. I doubt anybody on campus here even knows what that is. So I was on the cusp of seeing the technology. So it's been interesting to see my generation, really from '94 forward with the onset of the computers and the internet, and watch the industry change, and where the wineries now have direct contact with you. And that's been one of the big differences. I can have contact with a customer on my little iPhone right there, whereas Dad in the 60s and 70s had to get on a plane and get out there and hustle it on the street, and it was very different. One of the things I love most about the evolution of the industry and the stories that I get to hear from this guy, because it is a very different world in which we develop and sell and make wine today, is your story about when you would have to go down to San Jose in the Chardonnay section. May I help you out a little bit more?
Yeah. When we started at Robert Mondavi, one of the luxuries I had is not only did I have to make it, but I then had to sell it. And so my father said, let's pick the top 5 restaurants, Northern California, the top 5 retail shops, Northern California, the same in Southern California, the same New York, the same Chicago.
Dad got the retail shops so that my grandfather could go in and have a nice lunch and pitch the wine.
And so the best retail shop in what's now Silicon Valley was the Los Gatos Wine and Cheese Shop. And I went down, I would leave Wednesday mornings, one Wednesday a month I'd go to that part of the state, and I'd call on them. And I started out with Fumé Blanc. It was the first white wine we had. And no, not interested. Next time it was Chardonnay. He brings me over and he says, look, I have 4 California Chardonnays. I don't need any more. I have 4 wines from France, from Burgundy, Chablis. I don't need any more. Goodbye.
Circle K has a better selection than that now.
Long story short, 8 months in a row, the second Wednesday, at 9 o'clock in the morning before he's at his shop, I'm at his door. I didn't go with the same variety once. Thank God back then we had Traminer, Riesling, Rosé, Gamay, etc. The 8th time I go, he sees me and he says, you again. I said, yes, sir, but I have the Cabernet and it is absolutely stellar. You've got to taste it. He said, if you get in your car and get out of here, you can send me 5 cases of every wine that you've wanted to present me. I said, bye-bye, and got in the car, drove home. They became our largest single retail customer for the next 7 to 8 years. And it taught me, number one is, here you had this whole big liquor store, and there were essentially 8 Chardonnays, 4 California, 4 French, and the California section of wines that were not 20% alcohol and 20% sugar was very tiny. And I kind of shook my head and said, what in the hell did my father get me into? Anyway.
It's not the first time a boy has said that.
It's changed, yeah. Nor the last with yours. But the fun thing is, it has changed so dramatically. In 1974, surplus of wines, we had a contract, and we started Robert Mondavi, 50% of the production was sold in tank trucks to other wineries, kind of like my grandfather started out, and 50% we put in our bottles to sell to Los Gatos Wines and Spirits, etc. And we had a 5-year contract with a company that was owned by the Schlitz Brewery. And it was Geyser Peak Winery over in Sonoma. And they were buying 300,000 gallons of wine from us, 1973, 74, for a 5-year contract. Minimum 300,000 gallons. 74 came, huge crop. The dollar was weak. The franc did all this. The bankers for importers said, get rid of your inventory, give us some cash. To the wineries, they said, your inventory is not as valuable, you have to pay down your loans. If we didn't have that contract, we would have gone bankrupt.
You didn't have the contract bank break. And
yeah. And so we're in year 2. They said, don't even bother delivering the samples. We're going to break the contract. I said, but we have a written contract. You can't do that. And they said, well, we're going to. I came home, checked with our attorney, and our attorney said, young man, here's what's going to happen. They're going to terminate the contract. You're going to end up with 300,000 gallons of wine and no money. You're going to have to sue them. You'll win the first one. They'll appeal. Take another year or so. You'll win that. They'll appeal. You'll be bankrupt. So what are you going to do? And because of that negative thing, we went back and we said, we have to convert, just like in 1942. We have to convert the commodity to a consumer product. And thank God the Schlitz Brewery canceled that contract because that created Woodbridge, which became the most successful brand from a volume and dollar profit standpoint of the Robert Mondavi companies and family. And so one of the things that I've learned from a generational standpoint, some of the best decisions and the best turns for the industry are done when things are really tough. And you have to really think things through and you have to be creative. The mentioned Frescobaldi family, they're 31 generations. Lamberto Frescobaldi, I'd never seen him more excited than about 3 years ago. And he has been making wine there for 28, 30 years. He's all excited because his family had developed a new vineyard in a new area, and he, for the first time in his life, could come up with his style of wine rather than making the house flavor and the family style that have been going on for generations. And one of the things that's exciting, I think, now in California, and particularly for the students here, is that we, not just we the Mondavis, but I think we, the winemakers today, the wine families today, are realizing you can't just do what mom or dad or grandpa or uncle did. You have to let the young generations create their own style. The foods we have today are different. The lifestyle's different. The wines need to be the slave of the food and the lifestyle. They're not the master. And tell one of the, some of the things that excite you about the new opportunities.
Absolutely.
Well, are there any?
There's a few. So before we jump into that point, one of the things that I think is important to just take a note to take a look at is when we left the Robert Mondavi Winery in 2004 and had to take a hard look in the mirror of what will we do? It was absolutely wine, and Dad was very much smart enough to realize that with the consolidation in the industry, with the distribution houses acquiring one another, and the distribution books, so what the sales reps would go out on the street with, of literally being phone books of wine that they had to peddle and sell, that we as a small wine company, even though he had fabulous relationships through the industry, it was going to be difficult to bring wines to market through the 3-tier system. So he then spoke with the Frescobaldi family, who we were doing business with, and said, I'm leaving the winery. I would like to start an import company. I'd like you to come with us. They said, absolutely. The first day your doors are open, we are there. And then we solicited business with a few other wineries as well. The point of that Dad, in wanting to create this, is that he felt that with this consolidation in the industry, that it was absolutely imperative to develop an alliance or an agency where we could get some families together and bring world-class, family-owned, family-operated wineries to market together. we would have a synergy where we wouldn't necessarily ever be the largest volume of cases in a distribution house. But I can tell you right now, with the portfolio that Dad's put together of 17 different families in our company at Young's Market, we are in the top, out of 800 brands they have?
856.
Excuse me, 856. We're in top 50 of profitability. So the matrix shifts to where we'll never be the volume guy for these distribution houses, but we are important enough to where they will take the meetings. They will push our wines. And this was a shift that Dad saw that he recognized was important. In 2004, I had a desire to be more focused on our family brands, but when you look at the reality of where the market has continued to consolidate, he was absolutely right. And what's great about having a family team like that is we can have the aggressive nature of a young guy and the wisdom, well, I guess you know what's coming, but of the of the more seasoned gentleman to
Anybody
really
have a can of Boost or something I could drink?
But no, you really have. I want to drive the family brands, and Dad wanted to establish a beautiful, nice network where we would be relevant in the marketplace, and both were correct. And as we evolved, and as we saw the challenges that we as a family had had in the previous generations, and then looking at what the Frescobaldi's and other families brought to the table, we saw a few opportunities for the family to be able to continue as well. Now, even though we've been in this business for 4 generations, we can't seem to transcend a business for more than 1 generation as well. Charles Krug, that was a split between Peter and his brother, and then in 2004 at the Robert Mondavi Winery, we split again. So Dad and I talked about how are we going to do things different? How will we establish a format in which the younger generations, as they're coming up through the company and through the family, how will they have an outlet for creativity?
Yeah. The key question was, can we learn anything from the previous generations? Can we change the imprinting so that we do things different?
And the answer was yes, but it's not easy. And much like Lamberto, after being the lead winemaker for 30 years at Frescobaldi, was elated and relaxed and felt so energized to be able to have his own creativity, we saw that as one of the attributes that younger generations needed when coming into the business. So we created 3 brands under the Michael Mondavi family estate portfolio. Emblem, which is our entry tier, which is supposed to be more in the style of the day. Animo, which has a price position step up. It's really the bridge between what is modern and hip and what should have some elegance and balance to the wine. And then finally, the Tête du Cuvée.
The wine for the old people.
No.
Oh.
Then the Tête du Cuvée, which is really Michael's, our highest tier. And the theory behind the 3 brands is it allows for the hip wines to be available and the younger generation to focus on those and to be more in contact with the style at a more accessible price point that will have the opportunity for their growth. And then as they mature within winemaking and also within marketing, then they can go on to the more estate-driven concepts. So far, I feel that it's really been working. It's really interesting to have the 2 of us work together on the wines and to have my sister join in as well, who's a few years younger, and then to speculate of what will happen in future generations. We now have a model in which they can come into the business and have a safe proving ground and to be able to have their own autonomy. And so we're hoping that this is that next opportunity and evolution where we can transcend generations. But this wouldn't have been possible if we didn't look to the past and to the history that Dad saw led to the writing on the wall of where this consolidation would happen in order to develop a sales and marketing agency to bring these wines to market. So I think that what we saw that helped with our generational evolution was the ability to see the wrongs and where we had misstepped as a family business 2 generations in a row, and to be able to try to create a plan so that we could go beyond that. And that, to me, was one of the most special things about generationally moving through the business. What do you think?
Well, the other thing is, we in the United States are at a disadvantage to people like in Australia, Europe, etc. And the disadvantage is a little thing that happens when the family is at the highest emotional peak. And that's when the senior generation dies, and you get the pleasure of giving the state of California and the federal government 55% of your net worth. And it not only has the emotional burden to the family of losing a loved one, but it has the financial burden of how do you pay the tax bill. And especially in agriculture, in the wine business, where so much of your family wealth is in the soil, and guess what's been happening since you've owned that? It's appreciated in value. And if somebody dies without the proper estate plan in the vineyard or wine business today, they're going to be having to sell it under duress and not give their younger generations the opportunity of trying to work together the way they want. So not only do you have the emotional and psychological family transitions as we move on, but the financial ones add a lot of complexity to it as well. And it's a subject that nobody likes to talk about, but from a family business, it's vitally important to do that.
Do you want to maybe little questions or comments that you'd like us to address?
Yes.
Yes, I have a question. I enjoyed going to your winery, Michael Mondavi Family Winery, over the years. And it seems like about maybe less than a year ago, the winery was sold. Right? And so now I'm wondering, are you going to buy more vineyards and set up a new winery? And is there a tasting
I'm going to
room that
let
we
the
can go to?
future answer that.
So when we left Robert Mondavi in 2004, we quickly purchased that winery from Francis Mahoney. It was about a 100,000 case facility, which is a great size permit in Napa Valley. And we quickly found out that after we decided who we wanted to be when we grew up, after having this second opportunity, that we really wanted to be a little bit smaller. And so the winery, we really need capacity with our vineyard holdings that we have. We'll need capacity for about 25,000 cases. So that was about fourfold what we needed. So we had a family meeting, and we made a strategic decision to sell that facility. We didn't sell any of the brands, and we only sold the Chardonnay and the Pinot Noir that were attached to that particular winemaking facility. We kept all of our Cabernet and our Sauvignon Blanc, Petit Syrah, Petit Verdot, Cab Franc, and our other two ranches that the family owned outside of that entity.
And all the barrels and all the brands.
Yep. So we are hunting and looking either for the right dirt to build on or the right facility that doesn't come with a brand. I don't want to buy, and Dad doesn't want to buy, somebody else's brand. We feel very, very attached to what we've developed, and
If
we
we'd
want
buy
to
a
keep
brand,
that.
we'd bury it.
So I would say if we buy dirt, then it's 5 years before we get the plans and get it through the county. And then if we acquire a facility that we can move into, that'll be quicker.
Well, explain how we're doing things now, just as
So yes, that's a great question. So Dad wants me
we're
to
going to
address...
Safeway, picking up wine and rebottling it.
No. Oh, man.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Trader Joe's, better price. So what Dad asked me to address was, how are we bringing our grapes into a winery? Where are we doing this? How are we vinifying right now? So right now, within Napa Valley, there's a great movement for custom processing. So I've made an arrangement with a winery in Napa on Zinfandel Lane in the heart of St. Helena, where I actually have dedicated a bay of tanks. And I'm bringing in my own tanks, my own destemmer, my own pumps, my own team. So I invade their winery for literally 60 days, and I process 100% of my own fruit, and I vinify the wine. I barrel down, I put it on a truck that I bought, and we bring it all back to our barrel warehouse in Napa, where all of the barrel aging is done, all the final blending is done, and all the bottling is done. So I like to tease that we're a little bit homeless right now, but I had the best of all scenarios because I know that the work is getting done in real time to my specifications, where I don't have to wait for somebody else's seller team to execute the work.
Well, the consumer can't go to a tasting room.
Not right now.
Okay, so
And this is one of those great family debates. Dad wants a tasting room in downtown Napa, and
so
I'm
far,
enjoying my 5-year-old.
So far, he's winning the argument.
Yeah. So soon, though. Soon we'll.
Like in a year?
Yeah.
Thank you.
You
I
and my
needed
father.
that.
Here, I'll give you a car. You come to my house and taste instead.
Did I just hear him say that we can open his house as a tasting room?
Well,
Oh my goodness.
I'm glad this is on film because you can talk to my wife about this. Yes.
So, you know, at the turn of the previous century, there was a lot of immigration from Europe that really affected the California wine industry. Turn of this century, there's a lot of immigration from all over around the world, from places that don't drink wine. And I'm wondering how that's affected the wine business.
Bob. I don't mean to be cheeky, but I don't know that it has then. If we were talking about an influx of people in the United States who aren't drinking, is that what you're asking?
Not necessarily not drinking, but they don't
It's not their beverage of choice, like from
Yeah,
Italy or.
it's not part of the culture, you know, it's not part of the culture perhaps.
I think rather than immigrant or new to this country, I think age of the person is much more important. The Gen Xers, the millennials, et cetera, are far more interested in wine, far more interested in food and beverage than my generation and other generations. And I think whether you're immigrating from Asia or Mexico or Europe, the younger people are going to be very interested in wine, and they're texting and tweeting, and they're trying it with different types of foods. You don't just go to a French or Italian restaurant to have wine anymore in this country.
Yes.
To speak to that point, as well as the physical winery, the idea of that, what are your thoughts on the new concept of like an urban winery, something similar to what you might see in the cities like a tap room, but the focus is on wine, not beer or other spirits, allowing for a winery like yourself to take the product to the consumer that in the past would have had to make a trip up to Napa Valley?
No, I think if I'm hearing the question correctly, you're looking more of like an urban tasting room as opposed to production in an urban environment?
Right, well, so you can still do your custom fresh production outside, but you have your tasting room in the urban environment targeted at the...
So to give you an interesting example of where I'm actually seeing that work extremely well is surprisingly in Chicago, where there is a winery that's in Chicago, and they're out in the burbs, and they bring grapes in, and they bring juice in actually from California, if you can believe it. And they're also, they have a beautiful restaurant, and they have a retail room in downtown Chicago, or actually just outside Chicago. It's in the burbs. But it's really neat how this concept, as you're describing, has allowed customers to come to them and in a more urban type setting. It's not as you imagine either in a corporate park. It's not that. It really is in a more urban setting. And that's really been working too. There's been a few concepts that I've seen try to fly in San Francisco, but some of the permitting was a little bit tough for them. And I think that within San Francisco, as an example, I think that the people there might demand a larger selectivity to where it would become more like a wine bar or something of that nature. Because right now, with the choices that we have as a restaurant buyer, as a wine buyer, if I'm a restaurant wine buyer, the books of wines that come to me are thousands upon tens of thousands of wines. So I think that it would be difficult for a one brand wine shop to open in an urban area. However, if you look at Masonry as an example in downtown Yountville, they have a collective of 8 or 10 really high tier culty brands. I think something like that could really work in an urban environment as well. So I think the answer is yes, with the right matrix for the consumer satisfaction.
And the other aspect is having such a broad selection today on wonderful wines by the glass, from $12 to $15 a glass up to literally $50 a glass. You can taste a whole selection of wines in the restaurant setting, where in the past you had to go to a type of a wine bar or a winery itself to have that type of tasting experience.
Yes.
Question? You guys know all the most of the great wine families of Europe. My sense is, for whatever reason, they have been slow to adopt a DTC, a modern DTC model, even though they have less legal restrictions typically in a lot of parts of the world than we do. do you see any evidence of the younger generation of these moving to a more of an American-style DTC model, whereby they would use social media and all the things
So
that
whether
you're
it's in
talking
France
about
or Spain or Italy
Yeah,
or whatever,
yeah,
within their country.
Yeah, within their country or here. You could,
Sarah-
there's legal restrictions on doing it here, but
Sarah Perez in Priorat, Spain. Thank the Lord I visited, so I have an answer for you. Sarah Perez in Priorat, Spain, actually opened a little restaurant in Priorat, and much like you were talking about, is selling her wines there and making wines. And she's doing a great job. She's actually married to Rene Barbier's son, so they have I think that's at Clos Mogador as well. It's, and then they have part of Clos Mogador. So they have 3 different wineries that are converging in one little restaurant. She's pretty darn good on social media and pushing it out there. I don't know how they're doing direct to consumer though, because I didn't at that time see where you could push that button on the iPhone and buy now. Wilson Daniels though, in the United States, Wilson Daniels is a broker of some beautiful wines from France. Their most noteworthy would be La Flève and Domaine de la Romanée-Conti. Wilson Daniels, with the blessing of La Flève and Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, has developed a direct-to-consumer entity here in the United States, and then they share profits on the back end of that. So while I can't comment on Europe, I can certainly comment that they've seen the value here in the United States and have supported that business model here. What about you, Dad?
I think that
pressure or request to set up a DTC model for the brands that you represent here in the U.S.
they would like us to do a better job of DTC to the wine collectors. To the wine collectors. And in Europe, they're just now really starting to focus on nice tasting rooms and welcoming visitors to the winery, which in 1968, 2 years after we started, I would be driving on Saturdays in the summer from Oakville from the winery south to Oakville, about 1.5 miles, turn around and drive very slowly north towards our winery, put the signal on, put my arm out, make an old grandfather slow left turn in hopes that a car would follow me in the driveway so I could get out and offer them a tour and a tasting of our wine. I probably did that 200 times over 3 years to try to draw people in. They're still in that position in Europe, and that's really a neat question, because I'm going to now pose this to each of the 17 families. What are you doing about this, and why don't you get started? Because it can explode. It could be
What I have seen in Australia and a little bit in Europe as
Store
well
door.
is more agritourism, where a winery now has guest facilities and a restaurant, and they are encouraging guests to come and spend the night, come in and enjoy their wines and enjoy a dining experience. But for whatever reason, as you know, in Napa Valley, if you talk about having a restaurant and a winery together, you're going to have protests from locals. So I think it's really interesting how other parts of the world in wine-growing regions are developing agritourism, and it's being very successful, whereas in Napa Valley, it's almost seen as evil. I don't quite understand how this has happened.
It's really interesting that, as I mentioned, there were about 12 wineries in 1966. Today there's 500. Well, in breaking out that group, there are about 30 out of the 500 wineries are heritage wineries where there are families involved multi-generationally. There are about a dozen corporate-owned wineries, the Constellations, the Treasuries, the large companies that own the wineries. And then there are about 430 lifestyle wineries that were started by people who've made a fortune in some other enterprise and wanted to get into the wine business. Now, we're talking some generational change. In the next 10 to 20 years, as husband, wife who got all excited and started a small winery or not so small winery in Napa, and their kids, how many of them, A, are going to be interested? How many of those that are interested are going to be capable? And I think we're going to see a tremendous turnover of those lifestyle wineries in the very near future. And it's going to be really interesting to see how that develops and plays out. How many of those very expensive wineries are going to be changed into something else? Whether it's a home for the mega rich or whatever, because many of the wineries are smaller than the size of many of those people's homes.
Do you predict that some of those wineries will get scooped up by the bigger guys? Like, how much of that do you see?
Well, that is going on almost every day. If it's a winery that has good vineyard properties, and if they're getting good ratings, they're being scooped up by whether it's investment groups or other larger wineries. And the consolidation is going to continue.
And it would depend entirely on the brand, what they're asking for. Is it scalable? You know, I mean, people grab trophies. You know, Patson Hall just sold. I mean, that's a great purchase. You know, so I do think that there is room for that. I think the ones that Dad's referring to are brands that are anywhere from 500 to 1,500 cases that are on a little 10-acre parcel. That those will be trophy purchases, I think, by somebody else in a similar type economic bracket where they want that trophy.
A purchase that just was announced, I think it was yesterday, the majority of nickel and nickel, Farniente, Dolce, was sold to the investment group that purchased Duckhorn a few years ago. And
Boy, they've
so
been busy.
and you know, when an investment group buys something, what is it, Walt, 4 to 7 years, they want to turn it over and see their money? Yep. So there's going to be, the good news is the wine industry, particularly in California, is not stagnant.
No.
And if it was stagnant, it wouldn't be very challenging or interesting. You'd just keep doing the same old almost. But it's so dynamic. It's fun. It's exciting.
Yeah, but in closing up a little bit, you have to remember something about Napa Valley. Napa Valley is 1/5 the size of Bordeaux. It is teeny. We have half the world's soil series. We have different climates available to us to be able to grow beautiful Cabernet Sauvignon, as well as some of the Burgundian varietals, and then some of the aromatics as well. We're very fortunate to be where we are, and to, from a geologic standpoint, have the soils that we have. So it's very special. So what we have is so rare and so unique that I look to the future as we have more greatness to develop, because we haven't tapped all the land. We only have in Napa Valley about, I think it's 13.5 or 14% of our total acreage in Napa County planted to grapes. It's nothing. So I'm not saying that there's a lot more to plant, but what I'm saying is there's a lot more to come from such a small region in Napa Valley, and I think we can look for better things to come in the future. I see right now with some of the farming techniques that we've used over the last 10 years, I'm seeing better quantifiable data come out of how we should change our irrigation practices, how we should change our farming practices. That's what's being studied here. I see different fermentation science being developed. I think that much like when my dad's generation scratched the surface on really creating great wines in California and Napa Valley, I think we're at another level to jump within the next few years again as well. So the future to me looks incredibly bright, and I think the next big move generationally is farming and vinification again.
Any other questions? Yes.
In terms of the premier Grand Cru of the world, you're certainly trying to move into that classification. Where do you see the major competition for Napa Valley high premium cabs and other premier wines?
If you're looking at Napa cabs, you have to first look to Bordeaux, and then I would look to Argentina, potentially Chile, but they have too much of the, what's the Merlot, of the Carmenere.
Yep, you like that.
But I think that particularly the younger consumers today are almost going ABC, meaning anything but Cabernet, anything but Chardonnay. And they're trying to learn about Albarino. They're trying to learn about Gruner Veltliner. They're trying to learn about Zinfandel, other than white Zinfandel. And so I think this is going to create a broadening. And Napa Valley is great for Cabernets, but it also has some areas that don't produce stellar Cabernet that can produce stellar other varieties. And we're about 10 or 20 years from really developing those.
Yes?
Yes.
Since the beginning of Napa, collective organizations have been pretty important, like St. Helena Viticultural Club way back in 1875, and then more recently the technical group and Napa Valley Vineyard Association. How important do you see those collective organizations today, both in transferring knowledge between winemakers within the valley and as sort of this outward sort of collective voice? And when you see them, how you see them addressing?
So I've done a couple of the technical seminars where I've brought wines in to the current Napa Valley vintners, and it's really interesting. So it's like, it's basically a little think tank. You're bringing in your fermentation protocols and everything you can share about the wine, and you taste and discuss, and as does your neighbor. And I think that's been positive. I think it's demonstrated a willingness to share information and to grow. How much did that move the needle on any of the times that I went? For me, selfishly, not too much with those groups. Where I see the best camaraderie happening is when you pick up the phone and you call Heidi Barrett and you say, this wine, this vintage, I absolutely loved it. This is what I liked. How did you harness this? So I've not gotten as much out of some of the groups as I would hope. Where I have seen groups develop or offshoots are winemakers who are tasting on a regular basis, tasting finished wines, and then going into their cellars and tasting. My assistant winemaker does that with about 5 other assistant winemakers, and she's coming back with great information. But that's because it's regular and it's reoccurring, the same tasting group, sharing notes, whereas what I've seen at the Napa Valley Vintners is with every tasting seems to be a different audience, so you're not getting that camaraderie.
You bring a different
synergy.
bottle and you brag about it, rather than an idea exchange. In 1944, Napa Valley Vintners was formed, and at the same time, Napa Valley Wine Technical Group was formed. And the Vintners was really on the more of the political PR stuff, and the Wine Technical Group focused just on viticulture and wine. And Andrei Chelachev, Louis Martini Sr., my uncle, people like that were involved in that originally. And that through the 70s and probably into the early 80s was very vibrant. And really, we'd bring samples, and it wasn't just finished wines, and you'd have the same group of, back then originally, 3 or 4 and then 10 to 12 people rather than 50 or something. And so you could really learn. I think that what Rob said about the individual communication, from 1966 to 1971, before December, I visited every winery in Napa Valley and brought fermentation samples that I just finished fermenting earlier that year and tasted them with their winemaker, and they shared them with me. Well, that's when there were only about 5 or 8 other wineries with labels. Chapelet was one of the first ones, and I had to drive up to Pritchard Hill to taste with them. Now, in 1973, there were so many wineries I couldn't get it done. And that's when there were only about 40. So the scale of it has eliminated some of the intimacy. The neat thing about the wine industry, wine is not qualitatively competitive. It's marketing competitive. And the winemakers share ideas, share viticulture knowledge and winemaking knowledge. When Walt was running Beringer and I was running Robert Mondavi, Ed Sabragia and Zelma Long and all the different winemakers who worked for us would share ideas. How do we make a better wine? And if we made a better wine in Napa, we all won. And there weren't such a thing as corporate secrets. A few big companies, I can't talk about it. But the rest of us, everything was an open book.
It is interesting. It really is a Napa Valley in California to be a little bit more open in general, as a rule of thumb. My assistant winemaker from Argentina she sheepishly came up to me and asked if she could join a tasting group. I'm like, why are you asking me? Of course, please join a tasting group. What wines can I get to help you in the tasting group? And then the question was, can I bring some of our wines in barrel? Yes, of course. Can I talk about fermentation? Yes, of course. So finally I had to pull her aside and say, why are the questions, what's going on? And she explained to me that in Argentina, you don't talk about that. You don't talk about your ferment, you don't talk about your barrels, you don't share information the same way we do here.
Corporate secrets.
So it's great, and I love the culture of the young winemakers that we have right now who are wanting to do that.
And the neat thing is the consumer is going to win, and so will the companies. Yes.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about ratings. I think there is going to be a change in ratings. We've been dominated so much by Parkers and things like that. But marketing-wise, you want to have a number, and yet everything is all between 85 and 95. And there's a 4-point variation in taster and blind tastings and things, so we know they don't mean a lot. How do you really see it going in the future? Because you talked about it's going to be more blogging and stuff potentially or whatever. What do you really?
We talked about that today with the undergrads and the grad students, and it was interesting. And the reason why I mention it is because they're the ones who are going to be driving the bus, right? They're the generation who's going to change how we see these scores because of their purchasing power. So from what I've heard from them, and I've heard from other groups, is that they want to see more thoughtful discussion on wines as opposed to a rating number. I don't know how we get away from a rating number. It's a sickness, right? I mentioned it earlier. I said, I love my 95 and 96 points, right? That feels good. But in the same respect, it's what my dad really enjoys are the comments about the wines. So I don't know how we get away from a numeric score. I wish I had an answer. Maybe it's more like progressive education in the grade schools now, where it all goes to written evaluation. But I don't have the right answer for you because my crystal ball just doesn't work like that.
Yes.
Rob, you mentioned hip wines and estate-driven wines.
Yes.
Is the difference qualitative, or is it how it's marketed?
It's a bit of everything, to tell you the truth. So as an example with our emblem wine, which is a Napa Valley wine, it's 94% estate source. So I'll call it estate, even though it's not properly called estate. I try to make that wine with my sister to be a little bit more robust, a little bit more modern, and also a little softer in tannins, so that it's what I consider to be more approachable. So if somebody wants to have that while they're preparing dinner, great. Or if somebody wants to serve that as their beautifully presented wine for the night, it should have the body and the style to go with it. I blend in on the Cabernet a little bit of Petit Syrah because I want to have a little bit of an alluring aromatic to the wine that's a little bit different. I want it to be as if my wife just put on a different perfume. Like, this is distinctly my wife, but there's something a little bit exciting here, right? So I wanted to make the Cabernet, of course, very familiar, but I wanted to have something, just a little twist and a little bit alluring to it, and friendly. And then as we move into the next tier, the Animo, a Cabernet, I'm not going to fool around with aromatics or Rhone varietals in that Cabernet. It should be more classic, more stately. You should sit up a little bit straighter as you enjoy that wine. And then the M by Michael Mondavi, you should absolutely feel comfortable putting it next to a First Growth or something out of Bulgari or something from Spain that's just the best of the best in the world, or in Napa Valley. So that's really how I'm looking at that, and I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, hip meaning approachable.
Hip, yeah, approachable and a little more modern, right? There's classic
More for
in style,
today's food
there's more
and
today.
lifestyle.
Yes.
So why use the 6% out of state? What is it for?
Oh, well, I don't have any old vine Zinfandel, and so I've got a 1.5% in there, and then there's a little bit of Howell Mountain Merlot that goes into that, and then I've got a little Syrah that I blend in that I don't grow. So those components each add a different layer that I don't grow, and I really like, so I bring those in.
So our attitude is, let's make the best wine for that style, and if we can call it estate produced, we will, and if we can't, we won't. We're not going to let the nomenclature affect the flavor and style of the wine.
I think maybe we
Yes.
should. How are we on time? Should we wrap up? Take one more. What do you want?
One more question.
Okay.
It's urgent, but you're going to be here for the reception, so.
Okay.
Right.
I just finished reading your father and grandfather's book, Harvest of Joy, which is a great read. He talked about the cooperation between winemakers to make really better wines, which was really interesting. But the other thing he talked about was the state laws and the fact that they don't jive very well. And you mentioned this FedEx thing that solves some of that. Are there still a mismatch of state laws that...
You know, we deal in we sell
Tiger.
wine in 51 countries, the 50 United States and the District of Columbia. And when we export wine to Europe, you go into the European market, you register it once, you pay your European tax, and it can go in any of those countries. If we didn't have that type of craziness as a result of the repeal of prohibition giving the states the rights to control beer, wine, and spirits, there probably wouldn't have been the opportunity for us to start our Folio Fine Wine Partners and represent these other families.
And
Because you could have sold wine across one market rather than 51.
And then so to answer the other part of your question, so that's a little bit on 3-tier, and then to answer your question on a direct-to-consumer, how can I ship directly to certain states, and can I ship to all the states now? And the answer is no, I cannot ship to all the states now. We are registered in about half of the states because some of them, there's just not enough volume of purchase to pay for the registrations. But I think we can get registered in about, what, 30 and change now?
36, 37.
37
now.
states. And then so that means that of the ones that you cannot legally ship to, you can literally be arrested for shipping into that state.
And I
It's
like
crazy.
living on the outside.
Yeah.
One other interesting thing. We can ship to 37 states legally. Only our California wines. We can only ship to about 23 states with the imported wines. So there are
Different
the
license.
reciprocity between California and other producing states, and where they don't have reciprocity with Europe, we cannot do that. So it's really interesting how the anti-alcohol people, when they did the repeal of prohibition, really screwed the system up well.
Well,
Thank you all very, very much. It's a pleasure.
So not only did Michael and Rob share their knowledge and time with us, they brought some wine, and I just thought you might say a few words, Michael, about the wine, or Rob, both. And we will be serving it outside. This isn't just a tease. So.
I'll talk about the one with the screw cap because I can drink from the bottle. The Chardonnay is called Isabel Mondavi Chardonnay. Isabel is my wife, Rob's mother, and she, like all of you ladies, I think, have a better palate than most men. She's had a very discernible palate all her life, and she liked Chardonnays that are relatively lighter in alcohol, lighter in oak, and have a nice crisp finish, more of a Burgundian style than the heavy oaked California Chardonnays. And we really couldn't find any Chardonnays that she really liked anymore, so Rob volunteered to make a wine to please Mama. So we're going to have that as the Chardonnay.
Yeah, so what did you guys do for Mother's Day? So, and then to your question, this is the Emblem Cabernet Sauvignon. This is the one that's a little bit more modern in style, that has a little bit that, just a couple percent of Petit Syrah for the aromatic. So this is really our opening volley of let's have something that's extremely approachable, distinctly Cabernet Sauvignon, and very, very modern, because we want to keep people attracted to wine. So when they taste this Cabernet Sauvignon, it's distinctly Cabernet, but there's something that's just alluring and new that's going to keep them coming back. So this is the one that you had asked me about. 30 and 35 suggested retail.
And tell about the label.
The label's fun. We had a person in our marketing department work on this label for us. I had a beautifully misspent time in my 20s and in the cigar industry. And
I thought I was going to become an alcoholic.
and so I had produced cigars from Nicaragua, Dominican Republic, and Canary Islands, and then sold them throughout the United States, which was just a license for good and bad behavior. So on the label, I really enjoyed the great lithographs that they had on the cigar boxes and the art, and so we used some of the filigree and the vines to help design the label. And I think it's really pretty cool that it has a little bit of the family history involved there. It feels right. It's a nice package, and I wish I had designed it because it's great.
We wanted it really to express some of Rob's entrepreneurism and trying to create new things. And he's done it with the wine style, and why don't we go taste some wine?
Yeah. Right.